Welcome to this journey into the forgotten corners of American history, where the shadows of the past refuse to fade and the secrets buried beneath southern soil continue to whisper their terrible truths. Before we descend into tonight's investigation, I want to know where you are right now. Are you watching this alone in the dark? Perhaps during a quiet evening at home? Tell me in the comments what time it is, where you are, and whether you're brave enough to listen to this story with the lights off. Your presence here in our community of truth seekers matters to me. Tonight, we travel to Louisiana. The year is 1889. 24 years have passed since the end of the Civil War, and the South is struggling through the brutal era of Reconstruction's collapse. In Terrebonne Parish, where the bayous run dark and the old plantation houses stand like skeletal monuments to a dying world, something unspeakable happened in the ruins of what was once the Beaumont estate. On a humid October morning, Thomas Garrett, a timber merchant from Baton Rouge who had recently purchased the abandoned Beaumont property for its valuable cypress trees, made a discovery that would haunt him until his death 40 years later. While surveying the deteriorating slave quarters, structures that had stood empty since 1865, his boot broke through a rotted floorboard. Beneath the splintered wood in the shallow earth below, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A hand, small, delicate, reaching up from the darkness as if frozen in a final plea for help. What Thomas Garrett uncovered that morning was not just a body. It was a doorway into a family's darkest secret, a mystery that connected the antebellum South to the violent years that followed, and a story that officials would desperately try to bury again, this time in bureaucratic silence. The body belonged to a young woman, approximately 15 to 20 years old. But her identity would prove impossible to confirm. No. Missing persons reports matched her description. No family came forward to claim her. The local coroner's report, a document that would later vanish from parish records only to resurface in a private collection in 1973, noted something deeply disturbing. The body bore markings that the coroner could not explain, symbols carved or burned into the skin that matched no known practice in Louisiana at that time. But here is where our story truly begins, and where the comfortable narratives of history collapse into something far more complex and terrifying. Because Thomas Garrett's discovery was not the first strange occurrence at the old Beaumont slave quarters. Local residents had reported seeing lights moving through the abandoned structures at night. Some claimed to hear singing, the old spirituals that enslaved people had once sung, echoing from buildings that should have been empty. Others spoke of a woman and a young girl living there in secret, years after the plantation had been abandoned. And there were the rumors, whispered in the black community of Terrebonne Parish, about Charles Beaumont's hidden shame, about a daughter who was never supposed to exist, about a woman who had once been enslaved on that very property, who had remained there long after freedom came, bound by chains far stronger than iron. Tonight, we will examine every piece of evidence that survives from this case. We will read from diaries that were hidden for decades. We will explore testimony that was never supposed to see the light of day, and we will try to answer the question that has haunted researchers for over a century. Who was the hidden daughter of the Terrebonne master, and why was her body found inside the slave quarters? But I must warn you now, this is not a story with easy answers. The deeper we dig into the Beaumont family history, the more disturbing the picture becomes. What we will uncover is not just a single death, but a pattern of violence, secrecy, and desperation that extends far beyond one Louisiana plantation. The truth, as always, is darker than anyone imagined. To understand what happened in those slave quarters in 1889, we must first understand the world that created the Beaumont plantation and the impossible situation of people like Marie and Eloise. The Beaumont estate was established in 1823 by Jean-Baptiste Beaumont, a French Creole planter who recognized the agricultural potential of Terrebonne Parish. By the 1850s, under the management of his son Charles Beaumont, the plantation had grown to encompass nearly 2,000 acres of prime sugarcane land and over 120 enslaved workers. Charles Beaumont, born in 1830, inherited not just land and wealth, but a worldview that considered human beings as property. Contemporary descriptions from before the Civil War paint him as a typical plantation master, educated in New Orleans, ambitious and utterly convinced of the racial hierarchy that justified the entire Southern economic system. But Charles Beaumont never married. This fact, unremarkable to many historians, becomes crucial to our story. In the rigid social structure of the antebellum South, a wealthy plantation owner remaining unmarried past age 30 was unusual. Letters from his mother, preserved in the Louisiana State Archives, repeatedly questioned when he would choose a suitable bride from among the prominent Creole families. Charles always deflected these questions. The reason, hidden from polite society, but known to those who worked in the plantation's main house, was that Charles Beaumont had formed a relationship with one of the enslaved women on his property. Her name was Marie. We know painfully little about Marie's early life. Estate records list her as born on the Beaumont plantation in 1851, making her 19 years younger than Charles. By 1870, she would have been approximately 19 years old. What happened between Charles Beaumont and Marie was not uncommon in the antebellum South, though it was rarely discussed openly. The power imbalance was absolute. Marie had no choice, no agency, no protection under law. The relationship, if we can even call it that, was fundamentally one of ownership and exploitation. In 1871, two critical events occurred. First, Marie gave birth to a daughter. Second, Charles Beaumont died unexpectedly of yellow fever at age 41. The daughter was named Eloise. Now we must pause here and consider the impossible situation that Marie faced in 1871. The Civil War had ended, slavery was abolished. Theoretically, Marie was free, but the reality of Louisiana during Reconstruction was far more complicated and dangerous. The Beaumont plantation, like many in the South, had been partially destroyed during the war. The main house stood empty. The cane fields lay fallow. Most of the formerly enslaved workers had left, seeking new lives elsewhere or working as sharecroppers on other properties. The estate had no clear heir, as Charles had never married and had no legitimate children recognized by law. Marie, with a newborn child who was visibly mixed race, had nowhere to go. In 1871, Louisiana, a black woman with a white man's child, faced extraordinary danger. The brief promise of Reconstruction was already fading. The Ku Klux Klan and similar organizations were operating openly. Racial violence was commonplace. A child like Eloise, physical evidence of an interracial relationship, could be targeted for violence. And Marie knew this. So Marie made a terrible choice. She stayed. She moved into the old slave quarters, the very structures where she had once been imprisoned, and she raised Eloise there in complete isolation. She told no one about the child's parentage. She rarely left the property. She became a ghost, living in the ruins of the world that had enslaved her. Court records from Terrebonne Parish show that the Beaumont estate entered a prolonged legal dispute over ownership that lasted from 1872 until 1888. During those 16 years, the property essentially sat abandoned, while distant Beaumont relatives in France and New Orleans argued over inheritance rights. No one bothered to check the old slave quarters. No one investigated whether anyone might still be living there. This is where documented history becomes fragmented, and we must rely on later testimony and discovered documents to piece together what life was like for Marie and Eloise during those isolated years. A diary, found in 1947 during renovations of a church in Houma, Louisiana, provides our most direct window into this period. The diary belonged to Reverend Samuel Washington, an African Methodist Episcopal minister who served the black community of Terrebonne Parish from 1875 until his death in 1894. In entries from 1877, Reverend Washington describes visiting a woman living alone with her young daughter in the ruins of an old plantation. He writes, "I have met today with a soul in profound isolation. The woman, who calls herself Marie, lives as a hermit in structures that once housed enslaved people. Her daughter, perhaps 6 years old, has never left the property. The child speaks well, but knows nothing of the world beyond those rotting walls. When I asked why they remain in such a place, Marie would only say that the outside world would destroy them both. I offered help, offered to bring them into our community. She refused. There is a terror in her eyes that I cannot explain." Reverend Washington visited Marie and Eloise several more times over the next decade. His entries describe a woman who was both fiercely protective and increasingly paranoid. Marie taught Eloise to read using old books salvaged from the plantation house. She maintained a small garden. She collected rainwater. She survived by selling vegetables and doing sewing work for a few trusted contacts in the nearest settlement, always conducting business through intermediaries, never showing her face in town. But Reverend Washington also noted something else. He described symbols painted on the walls of the slave quarters, patterns that he recognized from African spiritual traditions. Marie, he believed, was practicing protective rituals, trying to shield her daughter from the evil she was convinced would find them. In his final entry about Marie, dated March 1889, Reverend Washington wrote, "I have not seen Marie or the child in several months. When I visited the old Beaumont quarters last week, I found the structures apparently abandoned. Items remain inside as if the occupants left suddenly. I have inquired in the community, but no one has seen them. I fear something terrible has occurred." 6 months after Reverend Washington wrote those words, Thomas Garrett discovered the body beneath the floorboards, October 14th, 1889. The day Thomas Garrett broke through that floor began as a routine survey of his newly acquired property. What followed would consume the rest of his life. In his own account, written in 1925 and preserved by his grandson, Garrett described the moment in detail that still carries the weight of trauma. "The smell reached me before my eyes could adjust to the darkness below. It was not the smell of recent death, but something older, preserved by the particular conditions of that damp Louisiana earth. When I lowered my lantern through the hole, I saw her. A young woman lying on her back, hands crossed over her chest as if arranged for burial. But this was no proper burial. This was concealment." Garrett immediately rode to fetch Sheriff Claude Mercier in Houma. What happened next reveals how differently such discoveries were handled in 1889, particularly when they involved black victims and abandoned plantation property. Sheriff Mercier arrived with Deputy James Whitmore. According to the official incident report, filed on October 15, 1889, they examined the scene and removed the body. The report describes a Negro female, approximately 15-20 years of age, deceased by unknown causes, found buried beneath the floor of the old slave quarters on the former Beaumont estate. But there was a second document. This one was never filed officially. Instead, it remained in Sheriff Mercier's personal papers until his death in 1903, when his widow donated his effects to the Terrebonne Parish Historical Society. That document, discovered by researchers in 1973, tells a very different story. In this private report, Sheriff Mercier noted several disturbing details that were omitted from the official record. The body showed signs of careful preparation. The clothing was clean, suggesting the victim had been dressed after death. The hands had been deliberately arranged. Most significantly, there were markings on the skin. Mercier described them as symbols of unknown origin, possibly carved or burned into the flesh of the forearms and back. He also noted something else. There are indications that 2 people lived in these quarters recently. Personal effects, including women's clothing of 2 different sizes, cooking implements, bedding, and books, were found inside. The larger bedroom shows signs of recent habitation. Both occupants appear to have departed suddenly, as food was left out and a cooking fire had been hastily extinguished. Sheriff Mercier interviewed several black residents of the area. Most claimed ignorance, but one elderly woman, identified in the notes only as Celeste, approx age 70, formerly enslaved on Beaumont property, provided crucial testimony. Celeste told the sheriff that a woman named Marie had lived in the slave quarters with her daughter Eloise for many years. She described Marie as deeply secretive, but occasionally trading vegetables and sewing work through intermediaries. Celeste stated that Marie was terrified of outsiders and had told her once that they would kill my daughter if they knew what she was. When asked about the race of the daughter, Celeste became evasive. She would only say that the child had her mother's eyes but her father's curse. The sheriff asked Celeste when she had last seen Marie and Eloise. Celeste responded that she had last seen Marie approximately 6 months earlier, in April 1889. Marie had seemed frightened, more so than usual. She had asked Celeste if she had seen white men watching the property. Celeste had not. After that conversation, Marie disappeared. Celeste assumed she had finally left the plantation. But here is where the testimony becomes truly disturbing. The sheriff asked Celeste if she had ever seen Eloise. Celeste's response, recorded in the document, is chilling. "I seen her once when she was maybe 16 or 17. Pretty girl. Too pretty for her own good, if you understand me, Sheriff. She had skin the color of light coffee and eyes the color of steel. She looked exactly like old Charles Beaumont's sister, who I remember from before the war. Looking at that girl was like seeing a ghost." The sheriff then asked the critical question: could the body they found be Eloise? Celeste's answer: "I cannot say for certain, but if it is, then you need to ask yourself who killed her and why, and you need to ask yourself where Marie is now." Sheriff Mercier attempted to locate Marie. He circulated descriptions to neighboring parishes. He inquired at churches, at freedmen's communities, at docks along the bayou. No one had seen her. Marie had vanished completely. As for the body, without any way to confirm identity, the coroner performed a basic examination. The official cause of death was listed as undetermined. The coroner estimated that death had occurred approximately 4 to 6 months before discovery, which would place it around April or May of 1889, consistent with when Marie was last seen. The body was buried in the paupers section of the Houma Cemetery in an unmarked grave. The case was officially closed on November 3, 1889, listed as an unsolved death, probably accidental or natural. Causes. But Thomas Garrett could not let it go. He continued to investigate on his own. He searched the slave quarters thoroughly and found items that the sheriff had overlooked or chosen not to document. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in what appeared to be Marie's room, Garrett discovered a small wooden box. Inside the box were several items: a daguerreotype photograph showing a white man in his 30s, later confirmed to be Charles Beaumont from before the war. A lock of hair, carefully tied with ribbon. A birth certificate dated November 12, 1871, for a child named Eloise Beaumont, mother listed as Marie, father's name left blank, and most significantly, a leather-bound journal. The journal was written in 2 hands. The earlier entries, from 1871 through approximately 1885, were in an educated adult's handwriting. The later entries from 1885 onward were in a younger, less practiced hand, but showing clear signs of the same educational foundation. Garrett read the journal in its entirety. What he found there disturbed him so deeply that he kept it secret for over 30 years. In his 1925 account, he wrote, "What I read in that journal convinced me that something terrible happened in those slave quarters, something that involved not just Marie and her daughter, but others from the community, possibly members of secret organizations and forces that I, as a Christian man, hesitate to name. I believe Marie was protecting her daughter from a fate worse than death, and I believe she was ultimately unsuccessful. Before we move forward, I want to pause here and ask you something. What do you think happened to Eloise? Was the body found beneath the floor hers, or was it someone else entirely? And if Marie killed her own daughter, as some have suggested, why would she go to such lengths to hide the body in a place where she continued to live? Share your theories in the comments. This community thrives on your insights, and some of you have proven remarkably perceptive in past investigations. Now let us examine what was written in that journal, and let us trace the horrifying events that led to that October morning in 1889. The journal begins on a winter day in 1871. Marie writes, "Today I held my daughter for the first time in the place where I was held captive. The men who built these quarters intended them as prisons, and now they have become our sanctuary. I have named her Eloise, after the saint of protection. She will need all the protection heaven and earth can provide." Marie's early entries reveal a woman of remarkable education, certainly unusual for someone who had been enslaved. She writes in clear, grammatically correct English with occasional French phrases. We can infer that Charles Beaumont had taught her to read and write, perhaps one of the few kindnesses in their deeply imbalanced relationship. She describes the daily routine of survival, growing vegetables in the overgrown plantation gardens, collecting usable items from the abandoned main house. Teaching herself to sew well enough to take in work, she writes with fierce determination about keeping Eloise hidden. "I take her outside only at night, only when I'm certain no one can see. She must not be seen. The world is not ready for what she represents, and it will destroy her for the sin of existing." By 1875, when Eloise was 4 years old, Marie's writings reveal increasing paranoia. She describes men on horseback riding slowly past the property. She mentions hearing dogs barking in the night, getting closer to the slave quarters. She writes about seeing torches in the distance and wondering if they were coming for her. One entry from July 1876 is particularly disturbing. "Tonight I heard them again. The men in white hoods. They were burning something in Johnson's Field, 3 miles from here. The fire lit up the whole sky. In the morning I learned that a black man who had argued with a white merchant over payment was found hanging from a tree. They say his wife tried to cut him down, and they burned her too. This is the world Eloise cannot know. This is why we must stay hidden." Marie's protective measures went beyond simple isolation. She describes creating what she calls marks of power on the walls and doorways of the slave quarters. These were symbols from African spiritual traditions, passed down from her grandmother, who had been brought from Senegal. Marie believed these symbols could ward off evil and protect Eloise from those who would harm her. Reverend Washington's observations confirm this. In his diary, he noted that Marie practiced what he called old religion, mixed with new faith, suggesting a syncretic blend of African traditional religion and Christianity that was common among formerly enslaved people who maintained connections to their ancestral practices. By 1880, Eloise was 9 years old, and Marie's entries shift focus to her daughter's education. Marie taught Eloise using books salvaged from the Beaumont Library. She writes with pride about Eloise's intelligence. She reads better than most adults I knew in the main house. She asks questions about everything, the stars, the plants, the history of this land. I answer what I can, but how do I explain to her why we hide? How do I tell her that she is considered an abomination by the laws of men? But Marie never told Eloise the full truth about her father or their situation. In an entry from 1882, Marie writes, "Eloise asked me today why we cannot go to town, why we cannot have friends, why we live alone in these old buildings. I told her that the world is dangerous for people like us, that we must be careful. She accepted this answer, as she has before, but she is 11 now. Soon she will demand more complete truths, and I do not know how to give them to her without destroying something essential in her spirit." The journal also reveals that Marie maintained contact with a small network of trusted individuals. Celeste, the elderly woman who later testified to the sheriff, brought news from the outside world. A man named Joseph, described as a freedman who worked various properties in the parish, occasionally brought supplies. Reverend Washington provided spiritual guidance and books, but Marie trusted no one completely. An entry from 1884 reads, "Even those who help us, I cannot be certain of their motives. Trust is a luxury I cannot afford. One word to the wrong person, and we are finished. I have prepared for this. If something happens to me, if they find us, I have made arrangements. Eloise will be protected, even if that protection must come in a form that will seem terrible to those who do not understand." What did Marie mean by this cryptic statement? The answer would emerge only in the journal's later entries, written in Eloise's younger hand. The handwriting changes in 1885. Eloise, now 14 years old, begins writing in the journal alongside her mother's entries. Her first words are, "Mother says I should practice my writing by keeping a record of our days. She says that someday someone should know that we existed, that we were here, that we mattered." Eloise's entries reveal an intelligent, curious young woman who is becoming increasingly frustrated with her isolation. She describes her world in detail: the slave quarters with their rotting wood and leaking roofs, the overgrown gardens where she spent her days, the books that were her only window into a larger world. But she also reveals a growing awareness of her own identity and the reasons for their hiding. In an entry from October 1885, "I looked at myself in the piece of mirror Mother keeps. I see what she sees, what she fears others will see. My skin is lighter than hers. My hair is different. My eyes are grey, not brown. I am my father's daughter as much as I am hers, though I have never met him and never will. Mother told me tonight that he died before I was born. She says he was a white man, the master of this plantation. She says this makes me dangerous to those who believe people like me should not exist." Eloise's understanding of her situation was remarkably sophisticated. She had read extensively about the Civil War, about slavery, about Reconstruction, and its violent aftermath. She understood that she represented something that the rigid racial hierarchies of Louisiana could not accommodate: a person who existed between the strictly enforced categories of black and white. In early 1886, something changed. Eloise's entries become more anxious. She writes, "Mother has been disturbed for weeks. She says she has seen men watching the property. She has heard horses at night. She has found footprints near our quarters that were not there before. She is adding more marks to the walls, speaking words in a language I do not fully understand, performing rituals that frighten me." Then, in April 1886, "Mother told me tonight what she has always feared. She says that when I was younger, word spread in the white community that a child of mixed race was living on the old Beaumont property. She says that certain men, members of organizations dedicated to maintaining racial purity, wanted to find me. They wanted to make an example of me, to show what happens to the evidence of race mixing. Mother hid me more carefully then, never let me outside during daylight, taught me to be silent at the slightest sound. Eventually, people assumed the rumors were false, that no one actually lived here. But now, Mother fears they have learned the truth again. The entries from late 1886 and into 1887 show Eloise's growing desperation. She was 17 years old and had never left the plantation grounds. She had never spoken to anyone except her mother and the few trusted visitors who came in darkness. She had never been to a town, never attended church, never experienced anything resembling a normal life. In August 1887, Eloise wrote something that, in retrospect, seems prophetic. I cannot live this way forever. I am not a child anymore. I need to see the world, even if it hates me. Mother says she is protecting me, but sometimes protection feels like imprisonment. I love her. I understand her fear, but I am suffocating in these walls. The tension between Marie and Eloise is evident in the later entries. They argued about whether they should leave Louisiana entirely, perhaps go north or west, where racial divisions might be less violently enforced. Marie refused, claiming it was too dangerous to travel. Eloise pleaded. Marie remained firm, and then, in the final entries from early 1889, both women's handwriting appears increasingly agitated. Marie writes, "They know. Someone has told them. I have seen them watching from the tree line. 3 men on horses dressed in ordinary clothes during the day, but I know what they wear at night. I know what they are planning. I have strengthened the protections, but I fear it may not be enough." Eloise's last entry in the journal is dated April 7, 1889. Mother is terrified. She barely sleeps. She sits by the window with a knife, watching for movement in the darkness. She has told me that if they come, I must hide in the place she has prepared beneath the floor of her room. She says it is the only way to keep me safe. I am frightened. I do not want to hide in the darkness. But Mother insists this is necessary. She says she has a plan to protect me no matter what happens. I do not understand what she means, but I trust her. I have always trusted her. That is the last entry in the journal. Thomas Garrett found these words 6 months after they were written in the same building where a young woman's body lay buried beneath the floor. When Thomas Garrett and later investigators examined the slave quarters more carefully, they documented a complex system of symbols and markings that covered nearly every surface. These were not random graffiti or vandalism. They were deliberate, carefully placed, and showed evidence of being maintained and renewed over many years. In 1947, when the journal and the site were re-examined by anthropologist Dr. Ellen Thornton from Tulane University, she identified many of the symbols as originating from West African spiritual traditions, specifically from regions that now correspond to Senegal, Gambia, and Sierra Leone. These were the regions from which many enslaved people in Louisiana had been taken. Dr. Thornton's report, published in the Journal of Southern Folklore in 1948, described the symbols as protective devices intended to ward off evil spirits and malevolent human intent. She identified patterns consistent with what scholars call vaves in Vodou practice, cosmograms in Congo spiritual tradition, and protective sigils from various West African systems. But Dr. Thornton also noted something unusual. Some of the symbols did not match any known African tradition. They appeared to be hybrid creations, combining African elements with symbols from other sources, possibly European folk magic or Native American practices. Marie, it seemed, had created her own syncretic system of protection, drawing on multiple traditions in her desperate attempt to keep her daughter safe. The most elaborate concentration of symbols was found in the small room where Marie had slept. the same room where the wooden box containing the journal was hidden. The walls were covered in concentric circles, spirals, crosses, and patterns that resembled stars or flowers. On the floor, barely visible after decades of decay, investigators found traces of what appeared to be ash or powder arranged in specific patterns. Dr. Thornton concluded that Marie had been performing regular rituals, likely involving prayer, invocation, and the physical placement of protective materials. She wrote, "The evidence suggests that Marie believed she was engaged in a spiritual battle for her daughter's life. Whether she was combating actual malevolent forces or the very real human threat of racial violence, or both, is impossible to determine. What is clear is that she devoted enormous time and energy to these practices, believing them to be essential to Eloise's survival." But here is where the evidence becomes truly disturbing. In the smaller room, the one that appeared to have been Eloise's sleeping area, the symbols were different. These were not protective marks. According to Dr. Thornton's analysis, they were containment symbols, designs intended to trap or hold something in place. Dr. Thornton wrote in her report, "The markings in the daughter's room suggest a very different intent than those in the mother's space. While Marie's room shows evidence of protection and warding, Eloise's room shows evidence of binding and containment. This raises troubling questions about the nature of Marie's protective strategies. Was she trying to keep evil out, or was she trying to keep something in?" When the body was first discovered in 1889, the coroner noted unusual markings on the skin. The official report was vague, but Sheriff Mercier's private notes were more specific. He described symbols cut or burned into the forearms and upper back, arranged in patterns that appeared deliberate rather than the result of violence or accident. No photographs exist of these markings, but 2 drawings were made by Deputy Whitmore as part of the sheriff's private investigation. These drawings survived in the Mercier papers and were analyzed by Dr. Thornton in 1947. Her conclusion was disturbing. The markings on the body are consistent with ritual scarification or branding, practices common in many African cultures as means of identification, protection, or spiritual significance. However, the specific patterns drawn by Deputy Whitmore do not match any known African tradition. They appear to be unique creations, possibly designed for a specific protective or spiritual purpose. Dr. Thornton raised the question that has haunted researchers ever since. Were these markings inflicted on Eloise during her life or after her death? Were they part of Marie's protective rituals, or were they something else entirely? Some researchers have suggested that Marie believed Eloise needed to bear these marks to be protected in the spiritual realm. Others have proposed darker theories, that Marie, in her deteriorating mental state, believed her daughter was becoming possessed or corrupted, and that the marks were intended to control or purify her. There is another possibility, one that several investigators have considered, but few have been willing to state openly, that the body beneath the floor was not killed by outsiders at all, but by Marie herself, as part of a protective ritual gone horribly wrong, or as a desperate measure to save her daughter from a fate Marie considered worse than death. We may never know the truth, but the physical evidence, the journal entries, and the testimony of those who knew Marie all point to a woman who was deeply involved in spiritual practices, who believed she was fighting forces both human and supernatural, and who may have taken action that, to an outside observer, would seem unforgivable, but that she believed was necessary. The Beaumont case did not end with the burial of the unidentified body in 1889. Over the following decades, new evidence emerged that complicated the story and raised more questions than it answered. In 1923, Thomas Garrett, now in his late 60s and in failing health, wrote his account of the discovery. He shared the journal with his pastor, Reverend David Mills, and expressed his belief that the truth needed to be preserved. Reverend Mills copied portions of the journal and kept them in the church archives. Garrett died in 1929, and the original journal disappeared. For 18 years, it was presumed lost. Then, in 1947, during renovations of that same church, workers discovered a metal box hidden in a sealed space behind the altar. Inside was the journal, along with a letter from Thomas Garrett dated 1925. The letter reads in part, "I have hidden this document because I fear what would happen if it fell into the wrong hands. The Beaumont family, though long gone from Louisiana, still has relatives who would not want this story known. But more importantly, there are things written in this journal that suggest Marie was involved with practices that many would consider witchcraft or devil worship. I do not wish to sully her memory or invite persecution of those who might practice similar traditions. However, I believe the truth should be preserved. Perhaps future generations will be wiser and more understanding than ours." The rediscovery of the journal in 1947 coincided with a broader effort by historians and anthropologists to document the African American experience in the South. Dr. Ellen Thornton's investigation brought new academic scrutiny to the case. But Dr. Thornton also uncovered something else. In the records of the Terrebonne Parish clerk's office, she found a land deed transfer dated March 1890, 4 months after the body was discovered. The property was sold by the estate's French relatives to Thomas Garrett. But attached to this deed was a curious document, a petition signed by 12 prominent white citizens of Terrebonne Parish, requesting that all structures associated with the former slave quarters be demolished immediately and the land consecrated by Christian clergy before any development proceeds. The petition claimed that the structures were sites of ungodly practices and Negro superstition that pose a spiritual danger to the community. It specifically mentioned symbols of devil worship found painted on walls and evidence of practices contrary to Christian faith and civilized society. Thomas Garrett had refused this request. The slave quarters remained standing until they finally collapsed from decay in the 1930s. But the petition reveals that the white community was deeply disturbed by what they found in those buildings, not just the body, but the extensive ritual markings that covered every surface. In 1952, a woman named Ruth DeVoe, age 73, gave an interview to a researcher from Louisiana State University who was collecting oral histories from descendants of enslaved people. Ruth was the granddaughter of Celeste, the woman who had testified to Sheriff Mercier in 1889. Ruth's testimony, preserved in the LSU Oral History Archives, provides crucial new information. She stated that her grandmother Celeste had told her the full story before her death in 1901, information that Celeste had been too frightened to share with white authorities at the time. According to Ruth, Celeste claimed that in April 1889, Marie had come to her in the night, desperate and terrified. Marie told Celeste that white men had discovered where she and Eloise were living. These men were members of a secret organization, possibly the Knights of the White Camellia, or a similar group dedicated to enforcing racial purity through violence and intimidation. Marie told Celeste that these men had sent her a message. They would come for Eloise within the week. They would take her, abuse her, and kill her as an example to any others who might transgress racial boundaries. Marie had only days to act. Celeste claimed that Marie asked her for help in performing a specific ritual, one that Marie's grandmother had taught her many years before. This ritual, according to Celeste's understanding, was a way to protect someone from physical harm by placing them in a state of spiritual suspension. The protected person would appear dead, but their spirit would be preserved, safe from violence, until it was safe for them to return. Ruth DeVoe reported that her grandmother was horrified by this request and refused to participate. She told Marie that such practices were dangerous and that she did not believe they truly worked. She begged Marie to flee instead, to take Eloise and run north where they might find safety. Marie refused. She said she had no money for travel, no contacts outside Louisiana, and no way to protect Eloise during a journey where they would be visible and vulnerable. She believed the ritual was their only chance. According to Ruth, Celeste never saw Marie or Eloise again after that night. She assumed Marie had attempted the ritual alone. Now we must pause and consider what this testimony means. If Ruth's account of her grandmother's story is accurate, then Marie may have believed she was saving her daughter, not killing her. She may have performed a ritual that she believed would place Eloise in a protected state, appearing dead but spiritually alive until the danger passed. But something went wrong. Whether the ritual failed, or whether Marie's understanding of it was flawed, or whether there was never any supernatural element at all, and this was simply a tragedy born of desperation and magical thinking, we cannot know. What we do know is that a young woman died, and her body was hidden beneath the floor of the slave quarters. In 1968, another piece of evidence emerged. A man named Robert Chevalier, a retired postal worker from New Orleans, contacted the Louisiana Historical Society with information about the Beaumont case. Chevalier claimed that his grandmother had worked as a domestic servant for a wealthy family in Houma in the 1890s. In that household, Chevalier's grandmother had overheard conversations among the white men of the family about the mulatto girl found on the Beaumont place. According to these conversations, several prominent white men in the community had known about Marie and Eloise for years. They had tolerated the situation as long as Marie kept Eloise completely hidden. But in 1888, someone had seen Eloise. A hunter passing through the property had glimpsed a young woman with light skin in the slave quarters. He had reported this to others. Word spread among the white community that Charles Beaumont's mongrel daughter was living on the old property. The men decided this could not be allowed to continue. Eloise was evidence of miscegenation, a violation of the racial purity they claimed to protect. They made plans to deal with the situation in spring of 1889. But when they arrived at the slave quarters, according to these overheard conversations, they found the place apparently abandoned. No sign of either Marie or Eloise. They searched the buildings but found nothing. They assumed the women had heard of their plans and fled. It was only months later, when Thomas Garrett broke through the floor, that the truth was discovered. Robert Chevalier believed, based on his grandmother's account, that Marie had learned of the men's plans and acted preemptively. Whether she killed Eloise to spare her a worse fate, or whether she attempted some ritual that went fatally wrong, Marie had hidden her daughter's body and then disappeared. But where did Marie go? This question has never been answered. In 1971, a researcher named Patricia Comeau investigated cemetery records throughout southern Louisiana. She was searching for any burial that might correspond to a woman matching Marie's description, dying between 1889 and 1895. She found something intriguing. In the records of St. Joseph Cemetery in Lafayette, Louisiana, approximately 70 miles from Terrebonne Parish, there is a burial entry for a woman named Mary Beaumont, colored, approximate age 45, died June 1892, no known relatives. The age would be approximately correct if this were Marie. The surname, though spelled differently, matches. The lack of known relatives fits someone who had lived in complete isolation. Patricia Comeau visited the grave. It was marked only by a simple wooden cross, long since rotted away, with the location preserved only in the cemetery ledger. She attempted to have the remains exhumed for potential identification, but the cemetery refused, citing the age of the burial and lack of legal justification. We will likely never know if this was Marie. But if it was, it suggests she survived for 3 years after her daughter's death, living under an assumed name in a different parish, dying alone and unconnected to anyone. In 1977, a final piece of evidence emerged. A construction crew working on a new highway that would cut through what had been the Beaumont property discovered something while clearing land. Buried beneath an old oak tree, approximately 200 yards from where the slave quarters had stood, they found a small collection of items. A tin box containing locks of hair, several pieces of jewelry, a small leather pouch filled with herbs and stones, and a piece of paper with writing on it. The paper was severely deteriorated, but forensic analysis at Louisiana State University revealed fragments of text. The handwriting matched Eloise's hand from the journal. The legible portions read, "Mother says this is the only way. I trust her. If I seem to sleep too deeply, please know I am only..." The rest was illegible. This discovery suggested that Eloise may have been a willing participant in whatever Marie planned, that she understood, at least partially, what her mother intended to do. Whether she understood that the ritual could actually kill her, or whether she believed, as Marie apparently did, that it would only place her in a protective sleep, we cannot determine. The items buried beneath the tree were characteristic of grave goods or memorial offerings. Someone, presumably Marie, had buried these meaningful objects as a memorial to Eloise after hiding her body beneath the floor. All of this evidence paints a picture of profound tragedy, a woman so desperate to protect her daughter from racial violence that she may have killed her, either accidentally through a failed protective ritual or deliberately to spare her a worse fate. And then, having done this terrible thing, Marie disappeared, living out her final years in lonely anonymity, carrying the unbearable weight of what she had done. We have journeyed together through one of the darkest corners of Louisiana history. We have examined evidence that spans nearly a century, from the discovery of that body in 1889 to the final fragments unearthed in the 1970s. And yet, for all this evidence, we are left with questions that can never be definitively answered. The central mystery remains: what exactly happened in those slave quarters in April 1889? There are 3 main theories, each supported by different aspects of the evidence we have examined. Theory 1: ritual gone wrong. This theory, supported by Celeste's testimony as relayed by her granddaughter, suggests that Marie attempted a protective ritual she believed would save Eloise from the violence planned by white supremacist groups. Marie may have believed that inducing a death-like state in her daughter would protect her spiritually while making her appear dead physically, thus removing her as a target. However, the ritual either was performed incorrectly or perhaps such rituals never had the power Marie attributed to them, and Eloise died as a result. Marie then hid the body, unable to face what she had done, and fled. This theory is supported by the extensive ritual markings found throughout the slave quarters, Celeste's testimony, and the fragments found buried beneath the oak tree, suggesting Eloise's awareness of what was planned. Theory 2: mercy killing. This theory suggests that Marie, knowing that white men were coming to brutalize and kill her daughter, made the terrible decision to kill Eloise herself, quickly and with minimal suffering, to spare her from the horrors that awaited. This would explain the careful arrangement of the body, the clean clothing, the peaceful positioning. Marie would then have hidden the body to prevent it from being found and desecrated, performed memorial rituals, and disappeared to live out her days in grief and guilt. This theory is supported by the evidence from Robert Chevalier's grandmother about the white men's plans, the timing of the death with when Marie was last seen, and the memorial items buried separately. Theory 3: murder by outside forces. This theory proposes that the white men who planned to harm Eloise actually succeeded, but in a way different than expected. Perhaps they arrived before Marie could act. Perhaps they killed Eloise quickly, unexpectedly. Marie discovered the body, hid it beneath the floor in a desperate attempt to give her daughter a burial and protect her from further desecration, performed the ritual she believed would protect Eloise's spirit, and then fled in terror for her own life. This theory is supported by the evidence that white men were actively hunting for Eloise, the marks on the body that could be interpreted as violence rather than ritual, and Marie's sudden disappearance. Each theory has evidence supporting it. Each theory has logical gaps. We may never know which, if any, is correct. What we do know, beyond any doubt, is this. A young woman named Eloise Beaumont was born into an impossible situation. She was the daughter of a master and a formerly enslaved woman. She was living evidence of the racial mixing that Southern society found intolerable. She spent 17 years hidden away in buildings that had once been used to imprison her mother and others like her. She never experienced freedom, never knew safety, never had a chance to live a normal life, and in the end, whether through ritual, mercy, or violence, she died in those same buildings that had represented bondage and suffering for so many before her. Marie, too, was a victim. She was enslaved, exploited, and left to survive in a world that gave her no options and no safety. She did what she believed she had to do to protect her daughter, and whether that makes her a murderer, a failed protector, or simply a desperate mother is for each of us to decide. The body found beneath the floor of the slave quarters represents more than one person's death. It represents the countless ways that slavery and its aftermath destroyed lives, forced impossible choices, and created situations where violence became inevitable. It represents the people who were erased from history, buried beneath the structures of oppression, their stories hidden or lost. To this day, no one knows with certainty what happened in those final days of April 1889. The truth lies buried, perhaps literally, in the Louisiana soil, along with so many other secrets of the American South. The slave quarters collapsed long ago. The Beaumont plantation was divided and developed. New buildings stand where those terrible events unfolded. But if you visit Terrebonne Parish, if you travel the old roads near where the Beaumont estate once stood, local residents will tell you that sometimes, on humid Louisiana nights, people still see lights moving through the darkness where the slave quarters used to be. They still hear singing, the old spirituals, echoing from structures that no longer exist. And sometimes, they say, you can see two figures, a woman and a young girl, still together, still hidden, still trapped in the place where protection became prison and love became the most terrible burden of all. Before we part ways tonight, I need your help to keep this community growing. If you found this investigation compelling, if you want to see more forgotten stories brought to light, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Click that bell icon so you never miss an episode from our haunted community. And I want to hear from you. Which theory do you believe? Do you think Marie killed her daughter to protect her, or did something else happen in those slave quarters? Have you ever heard similar stories from your own family history about the terrible choices people had to make during those dark times? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your insights and theories make this community what it is. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadows of history. Until next time, remember, the past is never truly buried. It waits beneath the surface, ready to reveal its secrets to those brave enough to look. Stay curious, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next investigation.